All right. We're recording in case anyone wants to go back and review this. So next week, we will have Monday and Wednesday class, and then we will also start with our Friday discussion sections. We will get information to you about that probably early next week. I'm not entirely sure yet. I may just go ahead and have it be on this same link. So that it's all in one place as far as our class information goes. That usually tends to make it easier for people. But we will let you know that. We'll also have a small addendum or a supplement to the syllabus that will have details as far as the discussion section itself goes. Grading for it is incorporated into your class grade. As you probably saw on the syllabus, there's a section for approximately 30% of the class grade that will be tied into that discussion. And it will meet every Friday. It gives us a chance to be in a little bit smaller groups because the Friday discussions will be split into two sections. So you have about half the class, which is, a good smaller group to be able to discuss things with. Most of those will be synchronous during that time on Fridays, just to keep things interesting and keep attention. We'll have a couple that will be asynchronous discussions. So those will be, typical discussion sections in our course shell where you can go in and post at any time. It doesn't have to be during that time on Fridays. But like I said, we'll detail all of that and get that information out to you probably early next week in advance of next Friday's discussion. Other than that, I intend to make these class meetings very regular. That I think, as far as I can tell, that was the last time I should have to cancel class, but weird things come up, and I do have a 6-year-old, and so stuff happens. But I try to let you know, hopefully, that messaging, the announcement in the class is working well for everyone to get those messages in time and not end up showing up instead. But you probably, if you did, you probably noticed that no one was here and hopefully figured out that that was not a class last Wednesday. Today we're going to continue the discussion kind of from where we left off, but jumping into the idea of what separates nations and how we kind of define these different terms, why it's important to define these different terms, and the differences. Today we will jump into ocracies and isms, because if you have been around political science at all, or if you pay attention to the news at all, you end up stumbling across at least an ism or an ocracy at some point. And there is a reason that we have these categories of words, and that we, structure them, not just for the fact that those are in fact Latin or Greek roots. So, from a linguistic perspective, it makes sense that we have these categories of words, but what that actually means and why that's significant in the modern day. And that is where we will be going today. So we'll start this. To start that off, I think there is a very entertaining video on YouTube that you can search out if you would like. All right. So cool. Now we all should be on the same page as far as all of human history goes. No, I really like that video, because it's funny. Obviously, humor always makes history a little bit better, not focusing on all of the negative, horrible things that humans have ever done, but also because it covers a great deal of history that I don't think a lot of people get in their normal school. Having taught now for 6 years, I think I'm on, I find that a lot of students coming out of high school, and my own personal experience coming out of high school in the United States, is that you don't tend to get to learn a lot of history outside of the West. And the West is extremely important, especially when we're looking at something like the United States. Our history is very much so involved in Western history. We do, as a form of government, as an ideology, which we'll be talking about, we do tend to take from these kind of Western traditions in the formation of the United States, and the philosophy behind our government, delving into, in a way that we will not in this class, but delving into the Constitution of the United States, the foundations of Great Britain, which obviously was, the originator of the American colonies. Delving into those, you are very much so steeped in Western tradition. So it makes sense that most of our educational system really focuses on Western ideology, but that's not the whole story. And as you saw in that video, which still managed to cover, the major events of American history, there's not a ton that America has been involved in. Obviously, the United States of America has only been around for a couple of hundred years. There are, entire empires and dynasties that lasted for hundreds to thousands of years, and existed before the United States even came into being. So as we are stepping into this comparative lens and looking at the world in a comparative way, it's really important to remember that fact and to go back to that fact when we're, considering what we're looking at. That is not to say that everyone will be perfect in this the first time. It is extraordinarily difficult intellectually to remove all of the preconceived notions that you may have. And our education system is built on using preconceived notions to build your base of knowledge. So I'm not asking you to do that either. I'm not saying, eliminate everything that you've learned up until this point, for this class will fill you with a new realm of knowledge. No, by no means is that even a logical way to approach learning something like comparative politics. Instead, just, what I will ask is that you try to approach each of these governmental systems that we operate with something of an open mind, understanding that there are extensive histories that exist for each of them. And the logic behind that, the evolution of these different segments of the earth, are all intertwined, but have very different origins that they have come from. So looking at these forms of government, we'll talk through a couple of these, but this is really just to give you an example of some of the different forms of government that we have as far as theocracies go. These forms of government are all pretty much founded in a Western ideology. And it's because the authors of our book, as well as most of the authors of political philosophy, tend to base their understandings in that Western ideology. So when we look back and we look at something like a plutocracy, which here is defined as a rule by the wealthy, that is named after plutocratic principles, which comes from Plato. So we have, a very Western concept of ways of even talking about different governmental forms. Each of these, I think, is important to understand, not insofar as, one specifically applying to a country or another. You can place countries into these different categories, understanding that they are never going to be perfect examples of any of them. We don't have on Earth a perfect example of a democracy. All democracies have some democratic aspects. The countries that we put into the category of democracy are still going to be democratic in a way, but have aspects that may seem undemocratic. I think the United States is an excellent example of this. We call the United States a democracy because in the United States, we elect the people who represent us and make decisions in government. And by that, we have this understanding that every citizen should have a vote. That's an interesting concept, and in a an individualistic type of society, which the United States is, it makes a lot of sense to say, okay, well, we will elect, and that makes us a democratic republic because we elect people who then make the decisions instead of voting on the decisions ourselves. But we'll elect these people to make decisions because the will of the people is something that is, very important to us as individuals. Our will, our individual will being expressed somehow in our government is very important, and we want to maintain that. That is not a belief that is shared by everyone in the world, or every country, or every form of government in the world. And it kind of makes sense that it wouldn't be. We tend to, in this individualistic kind of society, we run into issues of who we really want having that kind of power, because that works as long as I'm speaking about myself, right? Like my voice should have a place in government. I have knowledge that should be expressed, and my view of the world is somehow correct in certain ways. But then we run into the problem of, I will never agree with everyone else in society on all things, right? I may find groups that I agree with on certain things, but to find, that kind of universal agreement is never going to happen. And so we tend to then end up with democracies that are rule by the many, not rule of all people. It's rule of whatever majority opinion gets expressed. And democracies always struggle with maintaining that vote for the majority of people, if not all people, if they wanted to be a true democracy. Even in the United States, this is something that is not fully democratically expressed. There are several states that ban prisoners from voting, for instance, or even felons. Individuals who have committed a felony, as a felony is viewed as something that is an offense against the country. Sorry, this is delving a little too. I won't go fully into the legalistic understanding of the difference between misdemeanors, felonies, and criminal activity. But a person who has committed a crime against the country in many states loses the right for the rest of their lives to participate in democracy. And that seems very questionable. If you want a true democracy, if you want all members of society to have that vote and that say, why then remove it from individuals regardless of whether they have committed a certain type of crime or not? Why remove it from young people? The criminal idea is one aspect. We also don't allow individuals to vote until they're 18 years old or older. Why? Many of you are probably on the younger end. I'm not going to assume anyone's age, but most of you in college are usually in your early 20s, late teens. Maybe you're coming back to school and you're in your 30s. You've lived at least 18 years of life being affected by the rules of this country, having to abide by the rules of this country, being able to offend the rules of this country, being able to break laws and be punished for it without any say whatsoever directly expressing your views on those rules. We can push for younger representation. The average age of our representatives and senators now is somewhere around like 68. So not super working as far as that goes, but we can push for younger representation. You still have to be at least 30 years old to serve in the House of Representatives. So it's never going to get to that point where we have true representation of all beliefs. Now, I'm not saying that as though that would, giving everyone the right to vote would somehow fix aspects of the country. But we have to understand that anytime we use these words like democracy, it's a loaded word and it's a complicated word. We don't see full expressions of any of these. So we see, we talk about something like a plutocracy. We have had examples of that. Russia, really before Vladimir Putin came into power, was ruled by the oligarchs. There are oligarchs in the United States as well that wield a significant amount of political power and influence our political decision making. Autocracy being the rule of one person. This is, in fact, distinct from, a dictatorship or different things like that. There are differences where we can couch these in these different terms. One thing I will say is that a part of the reason that we have so many of these different terms is that there was a period of time in political science where the easiest way to get published was to just create a new term that you could write about. So that's something I'm trying to, back away from a little bit by giving us these core sets of terms to talk about. But you can come across hundreds, if not maybe thousands, of ocracies that just describe different forms of government. Theocracy is ruled by the religious elite. Again, we do see this in certain countries. Iran, which is a country that we'll talk about later in the semester, is a very theocratic government. There's a lot of influence from the religious elites in the country of Iran. Gynocracy, to give you an example of one that we haven't really ever seen, would be ruled by women. So we have different terms to describe different forms of government that we can use to talk on common ground about these big concepts that we're applying to the governments we're talking about. All of these live in a central concept of civil society. Civil society is not the government itself. It includes the government itself, the people in government. But civil society is the core idea of how you want your government to be formed and trained. So civil society includes everything you learned in elementary school, middle school, and high school. If you went to the American, school system, everything you learned through that about our government is all part of civil society. How we train the future civil leaders of our country from elementary school on up, how they learn about our government and what our government does, how our government should be structured, not just is structured, but how we form this question of why a government should be the way that it is, or why it should change to something else. All of this lives under this idea of civil society. And so when you're looking at different countries and understanding, the changes that we see in other countries, I would say somewhat more frequently than the United States. The main, large democracies of the world do tend to be fairly stable in their form of government. They can be disrupted by individual regimes, but, they tend to still kind of circle this main core concept, as opposed to countries where you see a lot of change in governmental form over time. Countries like Indonesia, I think, is probably a good example, a country that has had multiple regimes in probably, your parents' lifetime. Countries like that, you want to take a look at why their civil society changes so much. Because it's very easy to look at something like revolution and think of it as, a one-time event, right? Like the October Revolution. which took place in September because Russia uses a different calendar than we do. But the October Revolution, a revolution is not just a 1-month event. It's, not a few weeks. Each of these changes that may require a complete change of civil society means that you have to average approximately 16 years to implement a new form of change. Because, think of this in terms of what you learned growing up. The United States form of government, if there was a revolution tomorrow and the entire government of the United States changed into a different form, your learning, the learning of everyone up until today, will not have changed. It will take years to recalibrate civil society to fully support a new form of government. And so that's something that you see very often when we see governmental change, is that it takes years for it to format itself and be reinforced by new up-and-coming civil servants. That's also why it is so unstable in the immediate aftermath of any revolution. Why most of the time you'll see even intended democracies resort to some kind of, either military control, autocratic rule. October Revolution resulted in Vladimir Lenin essentially taking over as the autocrat of Russia. Even though it was intended as a communistic revolution, you still need some kind of power, some kind of control to implement stability on the new system and to oversee that change in civil society so that new people grow up understanding the form of government that is being implemented. So each of these, these are terms, we can come up with dozens of these. I think there were even more than this just used in that video at various places. So there are a lot of these. The main thing to understand is that we're just talking about where the main kind of power lies in a country. And that is something we'll talk about in terms of each of the countries that we'll examine over the course of the semester, as well as how that society has been raised to support itself. So that civil society learning side. Now, if we go one step up from this, these forms of government are implemented in countries, but there are bigger ideas. There are larger themes of political understanding that we can discuss. Those are generally referred to as ideologies, perhaps. There we go. So I want to talk a little on 5 of them. These are some of the ideologies that are brought up in your textbook. They are not all of the ideologies by any means, but they give us a good array of spots to point out on a political spectrum. As I said with the theocracies, none of these exists in pure form. Everything when it comes to politics is going to fall somewhere along a spectrum. So I probably should have written these more in a spectrum type format since I'm saying that, but they're not, sorry. Liberalism and communism are kind of, closer to ends of this spectrum. And that's based on what they focus on. Each of these is going to try to find a different way of balancing the individual's rights and society's rights. Essentially, if they come into conflict, which one should take precedence? Do we value an individual's rights to liberty, pursuit of happiness, those kind of concepts? Do we value an individual's determination of what they need in life? Or do we preference the needs of society? If we benefit everyone, the individual will inevitably also be benefited. But if we focus on that benefit of everyone, that will have to win out over individual desires at some point. So those are the 2 kind of ends of the spectrum. Liberalism as a big L, not a little l. This is not the Fox News liberalism. This is big L liberalism, focuses on the individual. Individual rights should be maintained above any benefit to society. Most democracies are couched in a liberal belief. And like I said, I have to use the big L liberal here because we're not talking about liberal and conservative. We are talking about liberal as in the core idea of individual liberty. So liberalism will focus on putting that individual over society. If you flip that, so the other side of this spectrum, to society being valued over the individual, you get communism. You get socialism at first, and then Karl Marx comes along and joins a bunch of socialist circles in the 1800s, and says that the socialists are a little too soft and that their ideas are never actually going to get anywhere unless you throw in violent overthrow of the former governmental system. And that's where Marx and his friend Engels come up with the idea of communism. Communism is that preference, that support of society over individuals, taken to a violent overthrow concept. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we start talking about some of the communistic regimes that are still around in the world. Overall, in large form, we see that there has been, for most of the West, more success in liberal ideologies. And overall, the East has tended more towards communistic or socialistic ideologies. So neither of these is right or wrong. And I will say, just because, that kind of quintessential battle, as we're taught, between liberalism and communism being the Cold War and being the USSR versus the United States, just because the United States won does not mean that communism is an absolute failure. There are several countries, including now, Russia and China, two of the largest economies in the world, that maintain forms of communistic identity. Ideologically, both of those countries are still communistic. So it is not that one of these is right and one of these is wrong. That was honestly where I think Marx probably got it wrong, because he said if everyone was communist, then everyone, like, the world would be perfect. That's not how the world works. Like, if everyone's liberal, I still don't think everyone's going to be happy, and the world is still not going to be perfect if everyone embraced a liberal ideology. Having the balance between the two is essential to our ongoing ideological stance. Speaking of balance, the kind of newer one of these, which is social democracy, is an attempt to balance those two ideologies, to take individual success and levy it into raising society as a whole, benefiting society by the success of individuals within it. Social democracy has, been, I don't want to call it a fad, but it's something that has been, popular lately. I think especially in some of the Nordic countries. It takes a lot of development to be able to format this, and so far tends to work in smaller populations that are extremely diverse, as opposed to, very large populations that haven't quite been able to embrace this yet. And since we're at time, that's a good pause point. So I will come back, and next week we will start with fascism. Well, that's an awful way to end the class. But yeah, next week we'll start with fascism, and we'll finish talking about some of these ideologies, as well as moving on to discussing some of the prominent democracies in the world. Thank you all. I hope you have a wonderful week. Don't forget to do the quiz that I think is due this week. And next week we'll jump into that discussion and have discussion on Friday and all that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.